morning to everyone. I welcome you all for the Toppers Talk Series 4, A Journey of Excellence, IPS as a Career. I request our beloved principal, Dr. Devasundari ma'am, to give the welcome address. Please, ma'am.
Thank you, Ramya. Good morning to all. Greetings from KCG College of Technology. It's a pleasure to welcome you all this morning for the fourth session on Toppers Talk by Mr. Vijay Shankar, IPS, Assistant Superintendent of Police Operations, Palamu, and Subdivisional Police Officer, Jharkhand. Every year, when the final results of civil services exam conducted by the UPSC is released, we know it will have several stories of grit, motivation, and inspiration. Candidates from a diverse background making it to India's elite administrative service. It always is an inspiration for all of us. We always see from those achievers that the entry into civil service has nothing to do with the educational background, your family background, your work experience, nothing. You just should be and should have an inclination towards the public service, set a goal, dream, and achieve with your full capacity. The consistent hard work usually pays off is the message we always have understood from reading all these stories in the newspapers. We do have many of our students who aspire to reach that goal, who are part of our NCC team and our KCG Civil Services Aspirants Club. To keep inspiring them and to give them a clear vision, we do this series every month and also open to all civil service aspirants from anywhere and everywhere across the nation. On that note, today we have with us Mr. Vijay Shankar, who secured All India rank 416. I hope I'm right, Ramya, in the 2018 UPSC exam. Starting as an ECE engineer into the BSF as an assistant commandant and then quitting it in 2015, chasing your dream to become IPS, it's truly inspiring for all of us. And I was also listening to your speeches in YouTube. I have to say this, it was very interesting to know that coming from a family of police officers, how posing for photos in uniform with your dad then became a passion for you from your 8th standard. It was really interesting to hear all your speeches in the YouTube. Also, I have to tell this to my students today. Being a part of the NCC during his college time, also enjoying his student life in Babu Kadai, but then knowing that degree is also important to chase his dream. He has a very strong message today for all of you. I'm sure today's session is going to enlighten all our civil service aspirants. Welcoming you, Mr. Vijay Shankar, for this virtual session. I also understand from your tweet handle that you were in a major task of encounters whole of last week. Thanks for taking time out of such a schedule to share your thoughts and experiences you had while preparing for the UPSC Civil Services exam and also while training in the Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel National Police Academy. Wishing you all the very best in your career and life. We also have our distinguished alumnus, Mr. Gautam, 2016 passed out from the Department of Mechanical Engineering, who has secured All India rank 178 in the examination conducted by UPSC for the post of Assistant Commandant in the Central Armed Police Force with us today. In fact, his contribution as student aspirant for the Civil Service Aspirants Club during his period of study is to be mentioned here. Thanks, Gautam, for as soon as, when we said Mr. Vijay Shankar is coming, you said, Ma'am, I want to join today. It's you still are the same, It's very good to have you today, Gautam.
Thank you.
I also extend my welcome to our Dean Student Affairs, heads of departments, all my colleagues, and my dear students, and also who have joined here for the discussion, Mr. Nitin and Muzammil. Also, on behalf of KCG College of Technology, I would like to provide again a very warm and hearty welcome to all of you who have joined us today. I think what I understood from Ramya is we have participants from different states today for this virtual session. Welcoming you all again. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Now I request our Dean Student Affairs, Dr. Anita Manuel, ma'am, to give the felicitation address. Please, ma'am.
Thank you, Ramya. So clearly, from the response to these Toppers Talk series, from the first one with Gautam to the current one, it's very clear that, many aspirants across India are there whose ambition or aspiration is to become a member of the civil services, whether it's IAS or IPS. I think it's because at a time when we perceive almost every sector as corrupt, corrupt at a time when we read of, all these 1,000 crore scams and we wonder what can they do with all this money. We don't even know how many zeros are there. At this time, we still regard or perceive the civil services, the IAS and the IPS officers as exemplifying both integrity and ability. These two qualities, has to go hand in hand, because without integrity, ability has little value. All those people are looting the nation, they are also have ability. So I think why we hold them in such regard is because we admire them for their ability as well as integrity. And I'm very glad that there are so many aspirants here for this service, because you people, that is, once you become IPS or IAS or any of the other services, part of the civil service, you become a major factor in the development of this nation. In your hands will lie the ability to make a significant difference in the lives of many. As our principal said, that esteemed guest today was an engineer, is an EC engineer. And on KCG campus also, there are many aspirants, which is why years ago we launched the Civil Service Aspirants Club, and Gautam was part of the club, and Muzammil also, who's here, is also part of the club. For the last 5 years, I think Ramya has been very ably coordinating the activities of this club, and I must congratulate Ramya for these Toppers Talk series, for which she has been inviting various dignitaries. Which started with our alumnus Gautam. Last time he was answering questions, and now he has joined us today. When he heard who was a guest today, he has joined us. Now I think he's going to ask questions like he was answering last time. And I'm told that both Gautam's dad, like our guest today, Mr. Vijay Shankar's dad, are fellow police officers. So I'm really looking forward to the fireside chat with Mr. Vijay Shankar, hailing from a family of police officers. As the principal was mentioning, the many interesting stories of his childhood, and the determination and the grit with which he prepared and continued till he cleared the qualifying exam is an inspiration. And there are even more stories of his action-packed career. I was looking at his Twitter handle, and when I looked at the handle that Ramya had shared, I realized my Hindi was in shreds. 30 plus years in Chennai has taken care that my Hindi is, not good as it used to be. But still, it was very intriguing to listen to Mr. Vijay Shankar's incidents and stories. And in anticipation of a great session, I request Ramya to introduce our chief guest of the day.
Thank you, ma'am. Today we have a very special guest with us, Mr. Vijay Shankar IPS, who's currently posted as Assistant Superintendent of Police, Palamu, and Subdivisional Police Officer, Southern Jharkhand. He comes from a family of police officers. His father, Mr. Kamaraja, is a retired IPS officer of the Haryana cadre, and his brother, Mr. Pragdish, is currently serving as an assistant commandant with the CRPF. Mr. Vijay Shankar is an electronics and communication engineer by qualification. He was part of the NCC during his college time. He had earlier made into the border security force as an assistant commandant, but quit from it in 2015, wanted to chase his dream of joining the IPS. There's a famous Japanese proverb, Nana Karobi Yaha Oki, which translates to fall down 7 times, get up 8 times. It is about never give up, and it aptly describes the journey of Mr. Vijay Shankar IPS. He started his UPSC journey in 2012 and finally succeeded in 2018 in his 6th attempt. He is a testimony of how perseverance can get you to the success. He passed out of the prestigious Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel National Police Academy with flying colors, winning the IPS Association Sword of Honor and 6 other awards for drill, field combat, etc. It's indeed a great honor, sir, to have you with us today to ignite the spark in the minds of the aspirants who are watching this webinar. I thank you once again for joining with us. Now I invite Mr. Bhakya Gautam and Muzammil to get into the panel discussion. We'll start with Bhakya Gautam.
Thank you, ma'am. It's indeed a great honor for me today that I have got this opportunity to interview my inspiration, senior in my preparation, and whom I look up to. So this discussion will try to draw inspiration and lessons from his journey to success, which will be helping the future aspirants. So let's start with a typical question which we mostly come across. There is a myth that only toppers can crack the UPSC. So sir, could you please share with us if you are a topper or an average student during your school and college days?
First of all, I'd like to thank you very much for your kind introduction. Thank you, Gautam, Ramya, and Dean Madam Anita, and Principal Devasundari. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. It means a lot. And coming to the question, I think it's a myth that you need to be a topper during a preparation. I never was an exceptional student. I was average at best through my life, beginning from school through college. So I think it's a myth that people say that you have to be good with academics in order to get through this exam. What you need to get through is perseverance. That is one thing that is it has to be a given if you want to crack the exam. But academic excellence in college, although it does help, it might help. I can't comment because I've never been part of that section of people. But I assume not being a good performer in school or college doesn't affect your chance much either. I had 13 arrears when I was in college. Through my school, I found it really hard to get through mathematics, like even to qualify to pass when I was in 11th, 12th grade. So I'm saying I was average at best, and it doesn't really matter. As long as you persevere and you're sure about what you want, and you go about doing what you do with conviction, you will see yourself through.
Okay, sir. So few aspirants can clear in their very first or second attempt. For others, it really takes time. You would have experienced such ups and downs during your long preparation journey. According to you, what mistakes can be avoided by the aspirants during their preparation?
To start with, I think the most fundamental mistake that people make is being carried away by the amount of material that's available these days. Everyone has access to the internet, and everyone has access to so much material, people are confused. So a good place to start would be to restrict the material and then go about revising that as much as you can, because it does more good to read the same book 5 times than to read 4 books, 5 books once. So ultimately, everyone's going through the same set of material. It's about how confident you are, how well versed you are with that will see you through. So I'd suggest that you keep revising and you consolidate the material that you are going to use through the course of your preparation. The smaller the set of books you're using, the more times you'll be able to revise, the better your chance at success. So that is another thing that has to be done. And thirdly, as far as the UPSC is concerned, selecting your optional subject makes a lot of difference. Pick a subject that you're comfortable with, that you're passionate about. Every subject is equally well performing. It's not that certain subjects are really well off and certain subjects aren't. It's never like that. It's a misconception. So you can get through with whatever optional subject you want to, but just make sure that you are passionate about that subject and that you're willing to give the time that it takes. I graduated as an electronics and communication engineer, but I qualified using Tamil literature as my optional subject. And this, by the way, was my 4th optional subject as well. When I initially taken the exam, there were 2 option subjects. So I had sociology and public administration then. Later on, as the exams pattern changed, I took 2 mains, 1 mains with sociology and public administration, and then 2 mains with sociology. And then I switched to anthropology in between, trying to because I always used to not be able to score in my option subject. So that was a mistake that I made. So I suggest that people take enough time before deciding what option subject that they want to pursue. And once you've decided on that, give it all you have. But ultimately, it's that every option subject is equally well performing. So that is the 4th thing that I wanted to emphasize on. To sum it up, summarize your material, consolidate your list of materials, keep it as small as you can, revise time and again, spend as much time as you can towards choosing your option subject, and revise as much as you can. I can't emphasize this enough. Revise and write. Practice is what will see you through. Yeah.
So, sir, as you just quoted on the information that yeah, like the internet is filled up with more materials, and we also have many free channels providing guidance on this. Like on this specification, there is any premier advice that you would like to give onto like specifying the stack of information that we can have for our study material? Like any guidance on that?
I could share with you the list of books that I used during my preparation days. I could do that. I could send it through Gautam or through Ramya, or I could post it here right on the chat box. So that is something we can do. But as far as the internet is concerned, I think it's about being able to rely on your cognitive abilities to decide what's best for you. Every academy is equally good. I wouldn't advocate for any like particular channel or website. Like there are different people that teach everywhere, and there are different materials that are good for different subjects. So you have to pick and choose what works for you. Ultimately, the facts in history will not change. It will always be the same. I might teach you a certain way, a certain other teacher might teach you another way. It's about the style of presentation. What works for you best, what helps you remember best is what's best for you. It's not like this academy is better than the other, this academy has the best material. It doesn't really make that much of a difference. I'd again suggest that you consolidate and revise time and again. I will share with you the list of books that I used during my preparation. I hope that will help. Like give you a good place to start with. You can always tweak that to make it work for you. Like experiment with books that work better for you. I just stuck with what worked for me. It's not like the only way that you can get through. It is what worked for me. If you prefer something else, feel free to experiment. But what I will send you, I think it'll be a good platform to start at.
Sure.
You had quit BSF in 2015, and consequently, you were not able to clear prelims 2 times. And what was it like? Did you regret making that decision, or were you like very confident that I'll definitely crack the civil services? Or was it a confusion like we already had a uniform service, and in the process of moving to something better, did we lose the one which we
had? It was a little emotional for me leaving the BSF. I actually was in tears when I quit the BSF because I was really passionate about the uniform, and I joined the BSF out of choice. But when I was resigning from the BSF, you have an exit interview wherein your senior, your DIG calls you and interviews you. He asks you why you want to quit. And I told him that I want to work in law enforcement, sir, and that the BSF is more of a border guarding force. Although it's a really professional force, it's one of the best forces India has. I think I'd want to work in law enforcement. I'd want to investigate cases and work in law and order. And he was like, okay, but aren't you gambling? But the UPSC has it has success rate of what, 0.001%. And you're throwing away what you have. And I told him then, sir, it's not a question of if I will make it, it's about when. So I'm confident I will make it, but I hope I make it soon. And he said, okay, if you're that confident about yourself, go ahead. And then I came back and I took the prelims. I failed the prelims just when I quit the BSF. I failed the prelims again the year after that. I started questioning myself. Like maybe I asked myself if I had done the right thing. I doubted myself, but then it's about picking yourself up again, getting yourself back together. Because I knew this is where my heart lied. I knew IPS is where I wanted to be. So I woke up and I realized that the regret of not having given this your best, of not having given yourself the best chance that you can at becoming an IPS officer will be a greater regret than being in another place and not being able to give it your best. So that's what I told myself. And there's this quote of Theodore Roosevelt. He wrote this. He gave this speech called Citizenship in a Republic. And there's this really good quote of him that's called "The Man in the Arena." That's something that kept me going when I found myself doubting my abilities. So I could read that quote out for you if you want to.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So it's called "The Man in the Arena," and I'll just read it out. Give me a moment. It goes, it's not the critique who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short time and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming. But who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. So that is kind of what kept me going. So I told myself that even if you are spending yourself in something, you're spending yourself for something that's close to your heart. So that kept me going. And there are times that you do doubt yourself. It's not like I was always like 100% sure that I will make it. I knew I would eventually. That's what I told myself. At least I never doubted. There was no plan B actually. I didn't have any second plan to say, in case I don't make it here, I will fall back on this. I never thought about that. I never gave any of that a thought. So you do doubt yourself sometimes. You do miss your uniform when you're preparing and you're not seeing success. So it does hurt, but that's what the UPSC is about. It's about not just your knowledge, but about what you are as a person. It tests your character. It brings out what they expect of an officer. So that's about it, I guess.
Yes, sir. That was a great quote. And could you share some advice for the aspirants who also face such similar lows in their preparation after failing in the prelims or mains? Some few words for them, for the mental part to handle such pressures.
See, given the numbers, I don't want to sound like I'm discouraging you, but given the sheer numbers of people, number of people that compete, more people are likely to fail than to succeed. That's how this exam works. So, but I'm not saying you have to accept failure as an option. But what I am saying is you have to learn to take it in your stride. It's not like if you've been successful through your academic career in school or in college, that you're bound to experience success in the competitive exams. Like success is an amazing thing to experience in the competitive exams. But I'm saying the failure shouldn't affect you as much. If at all, failure should only teach you to come back again stronger, to work on areas that you've been not been giving enough importance on, and to work on your shortcomings and to improve your strengths and to come back a better person. Because the exam always offers you another chance. It's not like it's the end of. You need to get yourself together once you fail, and it helps to have a good support group. Like we were a group of 6 friends who were preparing for the exam. And success and failure were accepted with equal ease. Like 3 of us qualified, 3 of us got through to the services, the other 3 didn't. But it does help, because when you have someone who can share your feelings with, someone who's going through the same thing as you, same journey as you, you have each other to fall back on, you have each other to support it. So support system is very important. I had a really supportive family. My father and my mother not once questioned my intentions despite failing for 5-6 years in a row. They knew I was putting in the effort and they were supportive like that. So I'd suggest that you develop a good support system, work with your peers, and it's okay to take time off. It's not possible for you to go about preparing for 15 hours a day, like 365 days before the exam. It doesn't work like that. There are days when you'll be able to study for 2-3 hours at most. There are days where you'll be able to put in 8-10 hours. Learn to accept both of them. Learn to maximize the days where you can do 8-10 hours, and learn to minimize the days where you have to do 3-5 hours. And there will be days where you won't be able to pick up the book at all. It's okay. Let go, sit back with your friends, have a good time, watch a movie, catch up, do whatever makes you happy. So it's about learning to balance everything and then giving the best that you have when you go to the exam. So set realistic goals for yourself. Don't say that you might hear toppers say that I've been putting in 15 hours a day the last 1 year straight. It doesn't work like that. There will be days when you won't be able to pick up the book. There will be days when you'll study 3 hours. There will be days when you'll study 10. And all 3 of them are okay. Try to minimize it. When you need to take a break, take a break. If you're feeling burnt out, if you need 3 days off, go take 3 days off. Take a road trip, come back stronger. So learn to understand what your body is telling you, what your mind is telling you. So work with yourself. You are your greatest competition. So long as you're doing better than yourself today, I think you have a really good chance at getting through this exam. You have to constantly be better than the person that you were yesterday.
So, sir, you have cleared the exam in 2017 with Tamil literature as an option. So, what, in your opinion, makes this to be one of the rewarding subjects, and who are those candidates who can take up this subject as an option for their career to be aspiring?
Like I told you a little while back, there's no subject that's rewarding. There's no subject that's unrewarding. Every subject is equally good. It's just about you being passionate about the subject and you being able to put in the time that is needed to see results. With Tamil literature, like I told you, it was my fourth option subject, and I graduated from a school that was affiliated to the CBSE. So we didn't have any second language after 10th standard, and I did my 10th in 2006, 5-6. That's when I completed my 10th standard. And then I took the exam in 2017 with Tamil literature as an option. The 12 years in between, I didn't have any touch with Tamil. The only Tamil paper that I used to write was the compulsory paper that you have to get through in the mains once a year, which I hadn't done the preceding 2 years because I never got to take the mains. I failed the prelims. So, and if I'm able to come, and even before that, I switched to Tamil during my 8th standard. Until then, I was in Haryana, so you didn't have an option of picking Tamil. That I was studying Hindi. So when you come back and you pick Tamil, and I got to do Tamil for 8th, 9th, and 10th 3 years, and then break of 12 years, I put in the time again, and then I was able to get through. So it's not about anyone who's passionate about Tamil can take Tamil up. If you're competent enough to like read a Tamil newspaper comfortably, that's more than enough. If you're able to make sense of Tamil movies, I think that's more than enough. If you're passionate about writing or wanting to take the exam in Tamil, anyone who's passionate about doing that, anyone who can read and write can take Tamil up, or for that matter, any option. It's just about the amount of time that you have to spend afterwards that will differ. But any subject is equally rewarding, and anyone who's passionate about Tamil can take Tamil up.
So, what fascinated you to choose IPS as your career? Was that because of your father as an IPS officer or your personal choice?
My father as an IPS officer was huge inspiration in my initial stages as well. I grew up watching him, so I always idolized him. I looked up to him. He was he still is my hero. So I look up to him like that. And when you grow up watching someone in uniform, people want. That's what I wanted to become ever since I could think for myself. So every day that went by, I'd be yearning for the uniform. Whenever my father wasn't at home, I'd try to, like, I was young then. We'd go buy ourselves uniform from the stores. Later on, when I grew up, when I was in like first, second year of college, like when I was 17, 18, 19, I used to wear my father's uniform when he was at home. So that was the only thing I could think about. One thing was that I'd grown up watching my father, but what made me want the IPS more later on was the fact that you'd be able to impact people's lives in a second. You're the first responder. You go to every place first. You assess every situation first. And the amount of diversity and the challenge that the job offers you, the IPS offers you, I think it's unparalleled. It's not a desk job. I like to be out on the field. So, and I thought the police was one job that would satisfy all of that. You deal with people, you deal with like regular civilians, with officers from all other departments, and what if you're able to make a proper assessment and you're able to do justice to what you're doing, you'll be able to save, like, say 8-10 years of a person's life. Otherwise, if you were to go to court, if your assessment is right, there are people with vested interests who might do things otherwise for whatever reasons. But if you were to do the right thing, the amount of impact that you have on the public is immense, and the amount of visibility that you have is immense. So you're able to go stand up to anything, anywhere. If you feel something is wrong, you have the power to stand up to that. And even during my days in school or college, I used to see like whatever was out of place, where I found people violating certain rules or orders, it always used to anger me. It used to upset me. And to be able to do something about that, being just a civilian isn't enough. I mean, wearing the uniform, being part of the police service empowers you in a certain way that no other service does. And the ability to be able to set things right, to be able to like stand up to what's wrong, to make a difference every day and to challenge yourself every day, that is something that inspired me to pick the police.
Sir, people get an inspiration of the life of an IPS officer. I mean, not inspiration, a perception about the life of an IPS officer from movies or other media. So they have good and bad perspectives. Could you share us what is the actual life of an IPS officer?
See, another thing that I have to tell you about policing is that it is a 24-hour job. You don't have rest days, you don't have off time. You don't have weekends, you don't have government holidays. You're here, and if for some reason some contingency comes up, no matter what the time, no matter where you are, you're supposed to be there because you're in charge of the jurisdiction. You're responsible for what happens there, good or bad. So that is a little demanding. But if that's what you expect when you come into the police, when you know this and you want, that's what you want, I think it's one of the most rewarding jobs. Being in the police, you don't get to spend as much time with your family. You don't get to like fulfill your social commitments. You don't get to catch up with friends as much, with family as much. People will start thinking you're making excuses when the reality is that you don't have enough time for yourself. You're not able to sleep 6 hours straight on any given day. You will always have your phone ringing or a wireless message coming and saying something happened somewhere, and you'll have to coordinate all that. So it is demanding, and there is a certain glamour, I'd say, that's associated with the uniform, not just with the police, with the uniform in general. Be it the police, be it the army, the navy, or the air force. When you wear a uniform, you represent the state, and it sets you apart, and people start looking up to you. And being a member of the service, it's important that you uphold the values that the uniform represents, and you stand up for what's right. And that means you won't be able to spend as much time with your family. You won't get to spend enough time on yourself. You don't get to go out, whatever it is. But there are sacrifices that have to be made. But if you know that's what you're signing up for, it is the most rewarding. So I'd come back and do this again if I had another lifetime. There's no other place that I'd rather want to be.
So we are curious to know about your training experience in National Police Academy. I have heard that few really quit during the training phase itself. Does it really take extraordinary willpower to get trained in shooting, running, horse riding, and other physical training?
You'd be surprised at the amount of abilities we possess. If I were to pick any one of you and send you to the National Police Academy, they'd make you a police officer. They'd make a police officer out of you. That's how good the academy is. That's how good the infrastructure there is. That's how good the staff there are, the faculty there is. But having said that, it does take a certain amount of like mental strength, because a regular day would commence at around 4:45, 5 in the morning. It will go on until 7:30 in the evening. So that's at least 14, 15 hours straight where you don't have any time for yourself. And then you come back, you get your dinner, you go to sleep. So because you have to get up at 4:45 again the next day. But that's one thing. People in general fall into the habit of leading a sedentary lifestyle during the course of preparation for the UPSC, because the UPSC is as such, it is a little demanding. So people start thinking that they start underestimating themselves. They start believing that, so they start thinking that they can't do the training. Whereas the ustads there, the trainers there, they're so good. They will make you push yourself. They will redefine your boundaries. The best thing about NPA, I'd say, is the gender parity there. Women officers are treated on par with male officers. There is no female IPS officer or male IPS officer. Everyone is an IPS officer. That's that. We go through the same training. We do a 40-kilometer route march. Women do a 40-kilometer route march. You spend 7 days in the jungle, they spend 7 days. You train together. You spend time together. There is no differentiation. When you wear the uniform, you're a police officer, you're a functionary of the government. That's that. And the kind of empowerment that it does for women, the message that it conveys to the society in general, I think is really inspiring. Because when you're an IPS officer and you're in charge of a subdivision, irrespective of whether you're a woman or a man, you will go out on the field and deal with the same hooligans or the same law and order situations. A bullet that's fired will not differentiate between a man and a woman. So that's the ethos behind, which underlies the training at the National Police Academy. Everyone is looked at the same way. There are people who came to the academy weighing 95, 96 kilos who pass out weighing 60 kilos. And so if you're committed, because everyone there is mentally strong, because that's why they're there. If they weren't good enough, they wouldn't be there. It's about making them trust their abilities, making them believe that they can do what they want to do. Although it is a little demanding, some people also, unfortunately, are injured during training because it is demanding. You fall off a horse, you end up with a fracture. There's part of training called the obstacle course. I mean, some parts of training are injury prone, but the police service is physically demanding. You can't not be physically fit when you're in the police, because you might have to pursue someone, you might have to run to some place, you might have to go 2 days without sleep, whatever it is. So the NPA makes you ready for that. It is very rewarding. I think it's an experience to be had. I would never say that it is something that's not doable. It's very doable. Some people quit because of their injury. They always come back to complete the training next year once they recover from their injury. It's not that they quit the service for good. So people who are injured, people who end up with a fracture, aren't able to recover in time. So they take 6 months off, 7 months off. They recover, they come back and complete the training next year. So that's how the training is. I think it is one of the most rewarding training experiences that you can ever undergo. And I think the National Police Academy is the best academy in India. That there is nothing that even compares.
We have heard about political pressure being faced by the civil servants, and police being the most visible arm of the government. You also have experienced such. So how do you view this, and could you share any such experience that you have had in your career?
See, being in the police, the amount of influence that's exerted on you becomes more visible, because police is visible as such. No matter where you are, if you see a uniform, you recognize that it's the police. So wherever there is discretion, there is bound to be interference, not just political. From whatever quarter that you have, you might have someone close to your family that wants you to help someone. You might have some of your friends telling you that this is a person that I know, please help him out. Or your senior saying, I want you to do this, or your political boss saying, I want you to do this. But ultimately, it comes down to your conscience. It comes down to how much you're able to stick by your decision. If you're able to stand up for what your decision is, and you're able to say that this is what I'm doing, and this is the reason behind which I'm doing this. And there's not many people that will tell you to do otherwise. Some political leaders call you out of compulsion when they're in the middle of a group. They are the representatives of the public. So when you have 100 people standing at the house saying, I want you to help this person, he's been stuck with the police for so long, he will call you as a representative of the public. There have been incidents when they've called me and said, help this person out. He's in this case. They call me back sometime later themselves and they say, I was in the middle of the public, so I had to tell you that out of compulsion. But please do what's right. It's about establishing a reputation for yourself. If they know that this is the kind of officer that you are, and that you will stand up for what's right, they will not bother you with such phone calls. Politicians are very understanding. They are more tactful than you think they are. And it is part of their mandate to represent the public. So they tell you what the public feels. But it's up to you to stand by your decisions, to go through your investigation the right way, and then figure out who the accused is. If you were to work on influence, we wouldn't be what we are as a country today. There are officers who've been giving it, who've been working by the rule book. That's why we are where we are. So there is influence, there is interference, but it's up to you. It's about how much you're willing to comply with that. If you say no, because it's you that has to give the orders, not the politician. If the politician could give orders himself, he'd directly call the person who's dealing with the case. It's you who's in charge of the subdivision. Whatever good or bad happens, it's up to you. It's your responsibility. So they will at best request you. And if you think it's the right thing to be done, there are times when they call you for genuine reasons as well. So it always helps to investigate impartially and then come to a conclusion for yourself. But having said that, there are times when you do what is right and politicians exert their influence over you. And if you're still not willing to budge, you're not willing to budge. The best that can do is transfer you. I'm 2,500 kilometers away from home. You transfer me 300 kilometers away. It doesn't make a difference. I will still be the ASP there. It's not like I'm going to go there and do some menial job. So it's about the attitude that you develop towards the job. I'm here. I'm equally happy. You send me someplace else. I'm equally happy there as well. I'll do the best that I can within my jurisdiction. So if that's the kind of mindset that you have, I don't think you have to bother much about politicians or anyone for that matter. That's about it.
So as shortly after you got the independent charge, you had to deal with the pandemic situation. So anything that you like to quote up on your experience over there?
Right out of the academy, all of us were looking to investigate major cases because you knew and as soon as you assume independent charge, you want to investigate cases, you want to find sensational murder cases, you want to detect that, you want to detect dacoities, you want to detect robberies, you want to make a difference. That's what you want to do. But then we were thrown, just as we went out of the academy, the lockdown was declared. 3 months out of the academy, I think the lockdown was declared. And we were asked to go enforce the lockdown. So it was a new experience for us. And we learned through mistakes. We made a lot of mistakes. I mean, you're not equipped for something like this. You're equipped to investigate cases. You're equipped to enforce law and order. You're equipped to deal with the public in a certain way. But enforcing the lockdown and to, again, you're the strong arm of the government. Government makes rules, you enforce that. So you try to figure out how you enforce certain rules in certain, because what you do in one area will not work in another area. Somewhere, in some places, people are more understanding. Some people are, they won't concede without a little use of force. Some places, it has to be forcefully enforced, the rules that are made. And some people will understand by appeal. So it's a combination of all of that. We tried several methods through trial and error. We started running a kitchen in the police station that I was in charge of during my training. During your training, you're supposed to head a police station for 3 months before you are given a subdivision. So during Corona, during the first lockdown, we started an initiative where we could feed the people with the local people's contribution itself. So people started giving rice and grains, and we set up a kitchen in the police campus where people without food, homeless people, could come and have food and then go. So initiatives like that, public relations initiatives like that, help in improving the police image, help in improving your credibility. Because people generally think a policeman is someone to be feared. Policeman is someone who will pick you up, take you to jail. That's what the general perception is. But when you do things that make people understand that you care for them, they start understanding that you are carrying out your job as well impartially. It's not that you have certain enmity towards certain people that you're doing whatever you're doing. It's because it has to be done. And once the people start to understand that, they start cooperating with you. It's also about the trust they have in you. And you have to work towards establishing that trust. And that meant spending time on the road, interacting with people, talking with representatives of the people, local representatives who could convince the people to stay indoors. So in general, you just walk to the street, draw a line, say this is out of bounds, you can't stay here. Anyone going out of this will be dealt with by force. You'll be prosecuted, you'll be sent to jail. But you can't do that when an entire nation is under lockdown. Unless people are willing to comply, There's not much that you can set an example. When people are violating the lockdown, when you prosecute 2-3 people, when you write them up, they understand that the government is functioning. But it is only meant to act as a deterrent. That's the idea that I learned. Like sometimes you have to prosecute seemingly petty offenses to send a larger message. So sometimes we did that unwillingly, but we did what had to be done. It was a learning experience as well, and I think we made a lot of mistakes, but we also got to learn a lot of new things. And Corona was, I mean, it is one of the most professionally, what do you say, like, enriching experiences, at least in the initial stage of your career, right? So, we were fortunate enough to go through that.
We have come across news about your Naxal encounters. So could you share your experience of working in the Naxal areas?
Working in the Naxal areas is always a challenge. Here, there are several. When you have inputs and you work towards that, you're always walking into threat. Like you don't know if they've placed an IED or if they're waiting in an ambush for you, or if they have some other nefarious intention, if they know about the plans of your movement, where you're coming in from, where you will induct, where you will de-induct, where you plan on spending the night. So every time you walk into an operation, it is playing with your life. And being in charge of your team, there's a sense of responsibility that you shoulder. And there is no scope for error, because any mistake that you make will result in you losing one of your men. And that one man lost is a huge blow to the morale of the police, a huge blow to the family of the policeman. And you have to sleep with that for the rest of your life, knowing that you were responsible for someone's life or death. So it is a huge challenge, and but every time you walk into the jungle, it's also a new learning experience. You get to know where the same jungle is not the same when you walk into it 10 days from now. You might walk into a forest now, and then 10-15 days later, you walk into the same forest. It's a different place. It's constantly changing. There are new challenges that come up. What was accessible earlier isn't accessible now. Some places are flooded. Some places have new vegetation. Some places offer you better cover. Some places don't. So every time you walk into the jungle, it is a learning experience. You always make sure that you never compromise on safety, despite it meaning that you will have to probably walk 10 kilometers extra. You never take the same path in and out. So we do a lot of different things. It is every operation is an experience to be had, and it makes you be grateful for the men that you command. The people under your command, they ask so little and they give so much. You ask them to go a certain place, go somewhere, they will do without question. Do that without question. And when you have that kind of power at your disposal, when that's the authority that you command, the sense of responsibility that you shoulder immensely increases as well. So I've been fortunate enough to have led operations, and everyone's always gotten back home safe. So, and another thing about anti-Naxal operations is that it requires a lot of planning and coordination. And it is not like they show you in the movies. It is physically demanding. You have no food. You take whatever food you can carry. You can't light a fire in the jungle. You don't get a good place to sleep in. You have insects. You have snakes. You have wildlife there. So these are things that they don't show you in the movies. So the amount of planning that goes into a Naxal operation is immense, and the amount of safety measures we take is immense. So I think that's about working in Naxal areas. Every operation is a new lesson, and it makes you appreciate the little things in life. It makes you a better man, I think.
In your short span of career with the police force, you would have had a rich experience. Could you share us 2 incidents in your personal career where you had saved someone's life or an act of humanity and an adventurous encounter?
Like to helping people, I think this pandemic has given us a huge opportunity to do that. Because when you're in charge of law and order, when you're dealing with people all the time, you're also in charge of sorry, you're in charge of transporting people from one place to another, about coordinating how people come in from outside states, migrants from other states coming in. And when you deal with that, the amount of interaction that you have with the public is huge, and the amount of people that you meet is also huge. So you develop contacts like that. You meet a lot of doctors, you meet health workers, you meet like people in general who are in a position to help. And because of Corona, we've had cases wherein you haven't seen the person face to face, but someone tells you that this is the person that is finding it hard to breathe even, and please get him admitted somewhere, please provide him with necessary medical assistance. And we're fortunately in a place where we can get in touch with people who can help, and we help that person, and 10-15 days later you get to know that this person has survived. And people with oxygen saturation as low as 55-60 have survived, because we were able to find them medical assistance in time. And when you know about that, when 10-15 days later you see someone's face saying this is the person whose life you saved, that gives you a huge sense of satisfaction. And this pandemic has afforded us a lot of opportunities to do that. And having said that apart, like, you help people on the road, you give someone who's suffering from dehydration, you give them some water, that they're immensely grateful. They look up to you like you're the savior or something. But all it takes is 2 minutes of your time. You stop the car, you give them necessary medical help if it's needed, call an ambulance. And there are innumerable incidents like that where you get to help people. But I think this pandemic has afforded us an opportunity to help people whose faces I've never known. And it is immensely satisfying to know that they've recovered well. And as far as this adventure thing is concerned, I think there's this one particular incident that I'm reminded of when I was in my probation, when I was heading a police station. I was regularly checking vehicles one evening, and we were trying to stop a little car, and he wouldn't stop. He just barged through the checkpost. So we started our car and we started pursuing him. Excuse me. And although the car was small, the driver was really good, and he was very good at maneuvering the car. And we had a Bolero, and it's not as maneuverable as a small vehicle. So we were pursuing him. We pursued him. We were asking him to stop, and we pursued him for about 35-36 kilometers. We pursued him because that is an area that's a little prone to Naxal movements. The place that I was posted in, like, it's the border of like outer area of Ranchi. So that's where the rural area begins from. So there is movement on now once in a while, and we had certain input, so we were working on that. And I assumed that this is the person who we're searching for, who we're looking for. That's why he's running, or whoever it is. I thought it must at least be some criminal who wants to run from the law. So we pursued him for half an hour, 40 minutes, about around 30-35 kilometers, and then eventually he started. We had the roads barricaded, so he ran off the road, and he started going on an off-road track, and we were pursuing him there as well. Like 10-15 seconds down the line, we couldn't see the car. The car disappeared. And we were driving at a high speed, so we were surprised. Then one of my constables noticed that this vehicle has gone into a ditch, the other vehicle that we were pursuing. So we immediately stop a car, and then we run down, and then we see who this person was. And there are 4 people who fall in a ditch that was filled with about 8-10 feet of water. And the car was precariously just hanging on the edge of the ditch. And we asked them who they were. And they were like, we're just regular people. We just want to move from one place to another. We were just worried you might do something to us. I didn't understand what he was saying. So I was a little skeptical about what he was saying. So we got the details and I had the criminal histories verified. And it eventually turned out that 2 of them were students and 2 of them were just regular good people, like hardworking people. And I asked them later, like, what forced them to do that? Because they were involved in a pursuit which might have ended badly for any of us. Like, we were fortunate that it ended the right way. Like, we could have gone off the road, they could have gone off the road, our vehicle could have taken a tumble, and we must have like been hurt in vain. So I asked them, and they were like, we were afraid that you will do something to us. And then we had them sit down, and then we had them. We spoke to them, like trying to make them understand what the police actually is doing. That we're trying to help them. So it was, the pursuit was a good adventure, and but it ended out like it was a little bit of a comedy towards the end, like the state of affairs. And then we had a good laugh, and then we went. There are other like incidents which I can't like discuss here, but the it would like suffice to know that the police is filled with encounters. Every day is a new experience in life.
So as I already told, policing is a 24/7 job and you don't really get a lot of personal time for you. How have you tried to balance it now as a officer, and also your perspective from the son of an IPS officer?
Like being the son of an officer and being an officer yourself, you realize how things are different. When I was younger, I used to wonder why father doesn't spend enough time with us. And all I could remember was going to school, coming back, and then father would be back home around 9, 10. We must be, I mean, most of the time we were asleep. And we used to make plans that used to be cancelled. Like 5 times out of 7, the plans that we made were cancelled because there was some other pressing commitment that came up. And in school, when I was younger, I wasn't able to understand what kind of job this is. But when you are in that role yourself, when you wear those shoes, you understand like how much of a sacrifice it is. It is true that you don't get to spend time with your family, you don't get to like spend time on yourself. But I fortunately have parents who are understanding, parents who've been through the same course of life, so they understand how things are. And that way I'm fortunate. And balancing it is you like, it's not that you can say that I will call you at 5 in the evening every day, or I will call you at 7 in the evening every day. You don't know where you'll be at 5 in the evening. There are days when you get to speak to your parents. There are days when you don't get to come home for dinner. There are days when you don't get to sleep for 2 days in a row. Days when you don't get to eat the entire day. So it is a little difficult to balance family and work, especially in the police. But if you have a family that understands the amount of work that you're putting in and the gravity of the work that you're doing, it is very rewarding. But ultimately, it comes down to supportive and understanding support structure, be it your family, your friends, your spouse, whatever it is. But you will not be able to honor all the commitments that you make when you're in the police. And unless you have someone that's understanding, it's hard.
So policing is physically and mentally challenging task. How you deal with the stress? Can women police officers also get equal opportunity? You have already explained, but
Women police officers will always have equal opportunities. And like I said, there are no women police officers and male police officers. We are police officers, and that's that. And it's not that women police officers, which is not the right term to use. Every police officer is equally empowered. When you're in uniform, everyone has a different set of skills that they bring to the uniform, bring to the police force. It is physically demanding, it's also mentally demanding. But when you know what to look forward to in the job, when you know that's what the job is going to ask of you, a footballer is not tired because he has to run 90 minutes in a game. He knows that's what he's signed up for. That's what he's doing. So police officers aren't tired like that. We are built for this. We're trained for this. This is what we do out of choice. We wake up every single day wanting to do this. So it is. It affords everyone an equal opportunity, and although it is mentally demanding, if you look forward to it, it's about how you want to look at things. You can look at every problem as an opportunity or as a challenge. So it's just your attitude that makes the difference. You will have to deal with it anyway. If you think of it as a problem, you will still have to deal with it. If you look at it as an opportunity, you will still have to deal with it. Eventually, it's your jurisdiction, it's your responsibility. No matter how you choose to look at a certain issue, you will have to deal with it. So if you can change your attitude and help deal with the same thing in a better manner, I think that will go a long way. So although it is mentally demanding, it is about how you look at the problem as a challenge or as an opportunity. So that's what makes a difference, I'd say.
You have taken training from the NPA, and also there would be a standard operating procedure for most of the crimes. But how would you deal with an unprecedented situation which is out of the textbook?
When you deal with a situation like that, like what are you referring to in particular? Is there anything in particular, or should I just?
Not particular, but then earlier you had said that the pandemic was something which is not taught when you just got on the ground and improvised. So something like that, similar.
So, like now you can rely on experience. You've seen a certain amount of policing for whatever it's worth, and you have seniors to who you can talk to. And but in general, when you're thrown into the sea, when you're given a certain problem, and you don't know how the standard operating procedure is, with an Naxal operation, you know how the SOP is. With a murder, you know what the SOP is. With a dacoity, you know what the SOP is. But when you're given a new problem that's completely new, that's completely unheard of before, and you don't know what to do, I think the first thing that we generally do, because getting through the UPSC, you have a certain mental caliber. You take a step back, you understand what the larger issue at hand is. You want to understand what the larger objective is. And once you understand that objective, you try to break things down into smaller steps that you can accomplish through the way. Like when we were asked to enforce the lockdown, we stepped back. We didn't know what had to be done. We didn't know which areas had to be contained. We didn't know how people should be allowed, or if they should be allowed to procure whatever they had to procure, like their essential items. And if they could get together, if they could move from one place to another, we didn't know. But we stepped back, and the larger picture was that we had to try and minimize interaction of people, try to minimize their movement. So that way we could spread the contain the spread of the virus. So that's what the larger objective was. So what we did was we took a step back, and we identified areas where the population density was huge. So we tried to minimize contact with that of people from that area with contact from other people. So whatever goods had to be sent in, we sent it in from outside. We tried to ensure that people stuck there and they didn't move out. And areas where population density wasn't so much of an issue, where people were spaced apart already, we try to make the patrolling vehicles go around and make them understand the importance of social distancing and all that, and try to tell them that you have to stick to this if you want to help the government in accomplishing its objective, and also to help yourself. So you take a step back, you analyze what the larger objective is, what the larger goal is, and then you break that, you work towards that in small steps. That's how we generally function.
So in modern day policing, day by day it is becoming tough dealing with crime or internal security aspects or cybercrime, etc., etc. Many such things are like we have an exponential of new crime occurring. So how do you deal with such kind of challenges as a part of day-to-day life?
Like I told you, like when you're dealing with cases day in and day out, you kind of get the feel for things. Like when you know cyber criminals are committing a certain offense, the first thing that you look for is what we call their MO, their modus operandi. So what drives them, what methods they adopt. And then we try to categorize people into that, like people who operate by making you disclose your OTP. People who operate by installing a keylogger on your device, so they get access to your password. People who are able to hack into your email and then recover your password. So we can. Am I audible? I'm sorry, there was an issue with the.
No issue, sir. You're audible now.
Okay. I'm sorry about that. So that's about, we try to look for the modus operandi of people. We try to categorize criminals into the methods they generally adopt. And no matter how you commit a crime, no matter how brilliant you think you might be, you always leave a clue. It's that one clue that we look for, and that is more than enough for the police to get to you. The smallest of mistakes is just it's more than enough. We just need some place to start with, and through experience, you know where to look for to get that one clue. And that is how we generally function. Be it cybercrime, be it a serial killer, be it whatever it may be. We just start looking for people for little clues that people might make. And I think we're equipped enough to do that. We're trained enough. We have enough access to resources to be able to detect any kind of crime, I think.
Okay, so now I call upon Nitin to take up the participant queries. So we have queries from participants too. Is Nitin?
Good afternoon, sir. So I'll be reading out the questions from the participants, sir. So first question we have got from Deepak Hariharan. So is it compulsory to know Hindi for all the civil service aspirants?
Not all. Not all. Hindi is not a prerequisite for the civil services. During your training at NPA, you have what is called the compulsory language part of training. So if there is someone from Tamil Nadu who's, let's say, going to Uttar Pradesh, he will have to know Hindi. And during the course of your training at the National Police Academy, they will teach you Hindi, and they will equip you enough to be able to read and write and be able to converse with the people there, so you can go about doing your job. That's this same with people who's, let's say, someone from Kashmir who's going to Tamil Nadu, he will be taught Tamil at the academy. So you don't have to worry about that at all. You don't have anything, nothing's a prerequisite. The only thing that you need to do is to be able to get through the exam. Everything else the government will take care of.
Yes, sir. So we've got the next question, sir. It's from Saranishwar. So after clearing prelims, what was your strategy for mains? So how did you plan your preparation?
As far as the mains is concerned, it's about being able to work to your strengths. And to be able to do that, I think it's important that you keep writing as much as you can. The only thing that I did different this time that I didn't do earlier was that I wrote a lot. This was my fourth mains when I got through. And you try to not leave any question unanswered, because any question that you leave unanswered is a chance that you're missing out on. You need to be able to give the examiner scope to award you marks, and anything that you don't answer is zero straight away.
Yes,
And
sir.
so that is something that I figured, that I will not leave any question unanswered, and that I will practice as much as I can to improve my writing speed and to be able to equip myself enough to complete every paper in time.
Yes, sir. So we've got the next question from Nitya. So would you please tell me why sociology optional is difficult and how to approach it? And what is the difference between sociology, anthropology, and Tamil literature with respect to your experience?
Sociology is not difficult at all. I think if that's how my message came across, I'm sorry. That's not what I tried to convey. That's not what I intended to convey. Every option is equally good. Sociology is a really good option. Like we were a group of 6 friends, and another friend of mine who got through, who's an IRS officer now, he got through using sociology. So it's not that sociology is difficult. Sociology is a really good option. It's just about being able to present facts in a way that is appealing to the examiner. And it's also about being able to study in a way that continuously adds value to what you know. So sociology and anthropology and Tamil, if you want to put it that way, sociology is a little bit of a humanities-based sociology and Tamil literature. And they're a little bit of humanities-based subjects, whereas anthropology is a little scientific. So you can still get away with writing answers and points. With sociology and Tamil literature, you'll have to be a little more elaborate. They will expect you to have a certain degree of fluency over the language, certain command over the language. So it's about what suits your writing skills better. If you want to like just throw answers in a point format, look for some subject that's scientific. If you're good with writing, if you think you can write and actually you can express yourself better if you write, go for something that's humanities based. It can be sociology, it can be Tamil literature, it can be anything.
Yes, sir. So we've
Just
got the next.
what's the strengths.
Yes, sir. So we've got the next question from Shafiq Ahmed. And sir, what was your strategy towards preparing for current affairs?
Okay. Current affairs is a subject that's really vast because when you're taking the exam, you'll have at least 1 year's worth of material to go through. So make sure that you consolidate your materials and that you have notes to rely upon, because what you're not able to revise before the exam is not useful. Because you might be able to, you might study a lot through the course of your exam, but if you're not able to revise that and if you're not able to reproduce that on the day of the exam, it doesn't add to anything. So it's about consolidating your material, having access to notes, and then being able to read that time and again before the exam so you can produce what is of value in the paper. So consolidate, make notes, and revise.
Yes, sir. So we've got the next question from Udaya Janani. Can you share about your mains answer writing, your first answer, how to improve your worst answers?
Like you start off by making a template for every answer. Like I had a fixed template. So irrespective of what the question was, like we have about a page and a half or two to answer depending on the question that's asked in the UPSC. So I told myself that I will always start with a small introduction, 2 or 3 lines, and that I will pick up important keywords from the question, and I will make sure that all those are addressed. So I start off with a small introduction every time. And then when you work on the body, you pick up answers from the question, or you pick up keywords from the question itself so that your answers revolve around that. And then before you conclude, you have a small summary where you say, this is what we've looked at. And then you conclude saying, thus we've analyzed whatever the issue at hand is. So my overall template was that I'd always have a small introduction, pick up 3-4 keywords from the question, make sure that my answer revolves around that, summarize and then conclude. So once I had this template set in mind, irrespective of what the question was, I could start off straight away. So have a template that works for you, work on a template that works for you, and experiment with that in the mock test. So you'll be really equipped when you take the final exam.
Yes, sir. So there's a next question from Maheshwaran. So could you share how Tamil literature need to be approached as an optional paper?
Sorry, I didn't get you. Can you come again, please?
So could you share how Tamil literature needs to be approached as an optional paper?
Pretty much like how you approach any other optional subject. You take a look at the syllabus first, and then if you like the syllabus, you take a look at the question papers of previous years. And then once you think the questions are fair and that you think you have a good chance at that, take a look at the material, talk to people who qualified already, and you'll be able to know how Tamil literature works as an optional. Like, but just make sure you always work on something that you're passionate about. With any optional subject, I'd always suggest taking a look at the syllabus first, and then taking a look at the previous year's question papers from the UPSC. and then at least talking to a couple of people who made it using that option subject. And make sure that you have access to material, like access to people who can help you on your journey. Like with, let's say we're taking mathematics as an option, which is a really good option. If you are confident in your abilities, that you won't need any support from outside, that's okay. But if you don't have an idea and you need support from outside, make sure it's hard to find people who will help you with mathematics. So find some subject that has access to material, like easy access to material. With mathematics, you will still have to work a little bit, but it's an amazing option. That's to reinforce what I said earlier. Every option is equally good. But if you're looking for an easy way out, find an option that has easy access to materials, people who qualified earlier, and always go through the syllabus first. That should be your deciding factor.
Yes, sir. So we've got another question from Maheshwaran. So what UPSC expects from aspirants, either dynamic wording while writing in mains answering, or just the normal language?
Absolutely normal language. Please stick to how someone in 7th standard or 8th standard would write. Try to imagine yourself like trying to explain your answer, what we're trying to get through, to someone who's in 5th or 6th grade, 5th or 6th standard. Like no flowery language at all. It doesn't hurt, but it's not necessary. Someone who's evaluating your paper will barely be able to give, like, you spent 3 hours writing the paper. The person who's examining the paper has targets to achieve. He will have to evaluate 100 papers, let's say, in a day. He will be able to give you paper 10 minutes. So those 10 minutes shouldn't be spent in understanding the meaning of certain words that you used, or in trying to look for your command over the English language. That's not what they're looking for. They're not looking for your mastery over the language. They're looking for your mastery over the subject, over analyzing the issue at hand. And the simpler your choice of words, the better it is, because you'll be able to get your ideas through better. You'll be able to score better.
Yes, sir. So we've got a question from Uday Janani.
Give me a moment,
yes,
please. Walk on. जैन साहब,
जैन सर बोल रहे हैं सर।
बताइए।
उसका अभी तो जहां से पहले फोन किया था उस
I'm sorry about that.
Yes, sir. So we've got another question from Uday Janani, sir. Any tips for CSAT paper as it is becoming tough every year?
Like CSAT was one of my major strengths. So CSAT, I never actually spent any time preparing for CSAT. But if you want to, if you're finding it difficult to get through with CSAT, I'd suggest that you pick up at least last 5-6 years worth of question papers and take a look at the CSAT paper and figure out what your strengths are. Like it has several sections to it. It has English comprehension, it has mental abilities, it has mathematics. So pick up the paper and look at what you're comfortable with and make sure that you answer that section first. So because it's become a qualifying paper now, you will barely need 67 marks to get through. So if you get like 20 questions right, you already have like 50 marks. And then you work on your second best area. Like it can be English, it can be comprehension, it can be logical ability, mental aptitude, whatever works for you. So analyze your strength, work on your strengths first, and then proceed on, like proceed with from your most like from your strongest area to your weakest area. Proceed to that section, categorize the paper into sections like that, and then proceed from one area to the next. And always use the UPSC's question paper as a benchmark for the level of difficulty. Don't look at papers from GMAT or other. What you have to work on is what you will have to give. So that's what it suggests.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. We are done with most of the questions. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Nitin. So now we came to the end of the program. My sincere thanks to Mr. Vijay Shankar, sir, for accepting our invitation in spite of his very busy schedule. Sir was really kind enough each time when I was discussing about the event also. Thank you, sir. I convey my heartfelt thanks to our management, our director ma'am, Dr. Rani Jacob, for providing us such a wonderful opportunity. My special thanks to our principal. She's always a dynamic personality, supporting us in all means. I thank our dean, Dr. Anita Manuel ma'am, for her constant encouragement. And I thank all the participants from other universities. And I thank my dear students and student coordinators. Thank you all. Have a great day. Thank you once again, sir.
Thank you very much.